Good afternoon, y'all. We're going to get started on our webinar. Welcome to Telling a Proactive Story, Messaging on Economic Opportunity in Challenging Times. I'm Will Coley, Communications Coordinator at the Opportunity Agenda, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. So as you may know, the Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. We work with partners to move hearts and minds towards lasting policy and culture change. So as advocates, we're faced every day with misleading, inaccurate, and untruthful statements about people living in poverty. And now with the midterm elections in a few weeks, it's like the economy is constantly in the headlines. But we want to tell a new story about the American economy that offers real-world solutions for families facing insecurity. So to help us do this today, we're joined by two speakers. We're happy to have my colleague Julie Fisher-Rao, our Director of Training, Narrative, and Journalism here at the Opportunity Agenda. Julie will talk about how the best way to counter false information is by telling your own affirmative story. That means avoiding myth busting or restating the false argument and then explaining why it's wrong. And next up, we'll have guest speaker Elaine Mejia of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Elaine will share how she helps state partners craft compelling messages that avoid jargon, address racial justice, and provide effective solutions for specific audiences. So we'll be taking questions during a live online Q&A at the end of the webinar, so feel free to enter any questions you have into the questions function on the right on your GoToWebinar toolbar. And you can join the conversation online as well by using the hashtag #FutureOverFear or by tweeting at OpAgenda, OPPAGENDA, OpAgenda. So, and after that webinar, there's going to be a short evaluation that will pop up on your screen. And if you could just take a few seconds to fill that out so we can be sure to improve future webinars based on your feedback. So let's get started. First up is Julie. Julie, are you there?
I am. Thanks, Will. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Julie Fisher-Rao. I'm the Director of Narrative Training and Journalism at the Opportunity Agenda. And today we're going to talk, as Will said, about how to really deal with all of this misinformation that is being thrown our way. It seems like there's a new headline of lies every day, a new tweet. And so what do we really do? And I'm going to be offering a little bit of information about how to specifically avoid myth busting, but really the most important piece is to be thinking about what your long-term story is and what you should be thinking about. Sorry, just going to work on this technical issue. Sorry, I'm going to keep going. So what you should be doing is thinking about really what your long-term vision is, what your long-term story is, what you want your audiences to be thinking about instead of thinking about the lies and thinking about the misinformation. So one of the things to be thinking about when you see a headline come up or you hear misinformation and lies, or not even just misinformation, but you feel under attack, is are you constantly playing offense or defense? And this means, are you just waiting for something to come down the pike to respond to, or are you actually consistently thinking about what your affirmative story is that you want out into the world? Are you thinking about the solutions that you want people to be thinking about? Are you consistently promoting those solutions and your long-term vision? And if you can really keep your mind out there down the line, the 5, 10-year, 20-year goals, and think, how does this moment that I have right now reach those goals over time? It really can be a little bit easier than constantly being on the defense and constantly being just refuting other false information or just fending off attacks. So one of the ways that we often respond to false information is through this myth-fact format. And you'll see this a lot where people will restate the myth or the untruth, and then they will say, often in very long and wordy ways, what the truth is. And it's an instinct to want to correct false information, right? But we see this myth about you should drink 8 glasses of water a day. I think we've each heard this. A lot of us have believed it to be true and followed that advice. But the fact, according to this, is that most people will get enough water other ways. But what are you going to remember tomorrow? You're probably going to remember the myth. And there's a number of different reasons for this. The CDC has also found that they did a myth and fact sheet where they told people about flu vaccination and why it was important, but they did it in this myth and fact. Myth, the flu vaccination causes the flu. Fact, it doesn't. They found that people started remembering the myth instead of the fact. So there's a number of different reasons for this. One of them is that we remember things that are stated as fact. Our brain has been taught to remember things that are stated as fact, and so we will remember those. And so repeating it just lets it sink in more. And so there was an example of the CDC again going on and talking about why there's this myth that urban chickens were causing diseases. They had a very long-winded explanation why that wasn't true, refuted. And what people remembered and took away from it was the very salient piece of information, which is that urban chickens carry disease. So if you're trying to refute something that is very easy to remember, it's a lot harder. So you really have to think strategically about whether it's worth it or not. It's also true that it just gives more airtime to something that's false. The CDC, again, came upon a false story about flesh-eating bananas, which, again, very salient, and told people, no, it's not true. But then because the CDC got involved, they're a big name, the rumors increased. So they actually became more widespread, and eventually the information was attributed to the CDC. So you can see how this can just spiral. And in the case of our current president, you can see why repeating some of those lies just gives them more airtime. And we see the media doing this all the time, obviously, because a lot of it is very salient. So George Lakoff, who's a linguist who many of us are familiar with and often listen to, makes this point that when you repeat Trump, you actually give him more airtime. You're spreading that message far and wide. So what do we do instead? And again, I want to stress that this piece is about repeating false information, but there's also just this bigger piece of having that long-term vision and telling an affirmative story. Always thinking, instead of playing the defense, instead of repeating lies and myths and just refuting them and throwing facts at people, thinking about your long-term vision is going to be the most important thing. Because it's more powerful to be playing offense than to be playing defense. For anyone who's familiar with sports, I am not, but I think the metaphor is a useful one. Here's an example of a piece talking about SNAP benefits. People who receive SNAP benefits don't consume sugary drinks at a higher rate than others in their demographic who don't receive them. So the problem with this, I believe, is that it's just inviting people to think about a stereotype about people who receive SNAP benefits. It's also not useful in my view, because why invite judgment on that anyway? It's already a very familiar story about I was waiting in line and I saw somebody buy XYZ with their benefits and I have judgment about that. There's really no need to conjure that up to audiences who you're trying to gain support with around benefits. So instead, what's the affirmative story? And the two infographics on the right, I think, do a better job of talking about this, talking about the farm jobs that SNAP actually contributes to, how it lifts people out of poverty. So again, finding a way to always be telling that affirmative story is just going to be more powerful. So start on your own terms. Second, center on the truth and state it up front. And if you can, ignore the myth entirely. Ignore the misinformation if you can, and center on the truth. Now, so on the left is an actual headline from the Washington Post saying, basically restating myths about people who are experiencing poverty. I would suggest, again, stating an affirmative story about who the working poor are and what this looks like for families in your state or community. It's not always possible to avoid misinformation there are some things that we need to correct. We're certainly not saying let all lies stand, but really thinking strategically about how to do it and when to do it and why you're doing it, I think, is the most important thing. So if the lie is dominating the headline, for instance, instead of restating it, are American streets threatened by a criminal alien crisis, quote unquote, instead of saying the American streets are not threatened by a criminal alien crisis and repeating all of that language, or saying immigrants, don't take away American workers' jobs, think instead about how to talk about I've been hearing a lot about folks coming to this country. Here's what I know about those folks. Here's what I know is happening. Here's what studies say is happening. Whatever. Just focus on what the real truth is without restating any kind of myth. And finally, to think about why is this happening? Why is somebody out there spreading lies or spreading misinformation? And to really think about how to counter it, because sometimes they're doing it on purpose, purposefully lying so that it will be spread out there. And, we can be strategic about how we think about that. So I'm going to hand it over to Elaine to talk about some real world examples, particularly on that long-term vision piece on people really telling an affirmative story instead of just reacting to kind of the daily headlines and daily attacks. So I'm going to turn it over.
All right, thanks, Julie. Elaine, you there?
Sounds like Elaine might be on mute.
Possibly.
Or we might have lost her for a moment.
Okay, I'm back.
Great.
Okay, there she is. Thanks, Elaine.
Yes, yes, excuse me, temporary internet glitch. So, well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'd like to share some observations. I was really excited about the fact that we were going to be having this conversation today. This is work that I think is extremely important with the work that I do to support the communications work and the messaging work of the organizations that are members of the State Priority Partnership. So we have a go-to organization in about 41 states and DC, and who are leading the charge on, building support for more inclusive economic policies and more progressive budget and tax policies and a whole range of things. And we work a lot on thinking about the need to be more proactive, to not tell the myths. I mean, like many of you, we observe the fact that most of our audiences are being fed a steady diet of myths about how the economy works and what the role of budgets and taxes and government ought to be. And it's very hard not to default to leading with trying to refute those claims. And so what I want to do with my time is just share a few examples of how our network and some organizations in our network have decided to really go on the narrative offensive when it comes to talking about the economy and really kind of seizing the economic narrative and trying to really stay grounded, at least with our public voice, on what we're for, what our agenda is, and our story, and of course our true story about how the economy actually works and the role of government and policy. So you can go to the next slide. So I just was going to highlight a handful of really exciting new state campaigns that are, like I said, fundamentally about sort of seizing the economic narrative. In 2017, a number of groups came together, even in the midst of how difficult state legislative environments have been since 2010, and with, like I said, what we know our audiences are being told every day about how things work, deciding to really come together and ask ourselves a question and give ourselves a couple of days to talk about, well, what really would it mean to go on the offense truly all the time, and with a bigger narrative focus, a bigger communications focus, and actually too, although this isn't the point of the conversation today, a very sort of robust apparatus for actually having community level folks be able to engage in this work too. So that's really where so many of our state partners have been shifting the work, and it's exciting. So I'm just going to mention a few examples of these. And these also had the goal of sort of shaping the election year debate, getting our issues and our story about how the economy works into the election year conversation, and seizing the opportunity of the attention in election year to really get these narratives out there. This is also a way for us to model for candidates who we might not be interacting with directly, but who might share our goals and our vision, model for them how to talk about this, how to go on the offensive, how to not spend all of their time refuting claims from the other side or from their opponents. These campaigns are all really exciting in that they're giving people a real role to play and a way to plug in themselves. And another goal, which is more of in the testing phase, let's see how it works, is kind of force our opponents to play defense, consume some of our airtime, sort of responding to us, right, and our truths for a change. And of course, all of this for us is about ultimately setting the stage for some bigger policy wins around economic opportunity. So the first example I'll mention, if you can go to the next slide, is in Georgia. Our partners are working on the Georgia's People-Powered Prosperity Campaign. And this is just a snapshot from their sort of blueprint that they put out there about what their economic vision is and what kind of policies they want to see Georgia enact at the state level. What I particularly love about this is that people-powered really has a double meaning. The campaign is not only made up of people, and they've been going around the state doing listening sessions in communities, but it obviously triggers a bigger idea about what really makes the economy work, right? The economy thrives and grows when more people can share in the prosperity, when people can contribute, participate, fulfill their potential. We talk a lot in messaging space about the value of shared prosperity, but it's really important to push ourselves beyond terms like that to what we really mean. Well, we mean economies thrive, people thrive, right? When people can contribute, participate, fulfill their potential. And next slide. This is a screen grab from their campaign website. And what I love about this is it's basically, and this is just a piece of this, it's much longer and you can scroll throughout it and look at all of it. It's a catchy visual way of them showing, here's how Georgians, support the policies that we're advocating for in this campaign. What's interesting about it is note that it's not polling about here's how Georgians don't support whatever, cutting government, cutting taxes, some of those things. Oftentimes when you're commissioning polling work, you want to lead with, here's how Georgians don't support these bad policies. But actually this is all about their affirmative story. When we invest in these things, Georgia's people and economy can thrive. And I love that phrase that's right up there at the top. Lastly, I'll just say, this is a great example of the Georgia campaign of how it's really being picked up by candidates. So without mentioning any names, of course, I'll just say that a particular candidate for governor, who we won't name, has actually, which I noticed that the person tweeted the other day, we are building momentum in places where campaigns rarely go and prosperity hasn't been. In rural towns, big cities, we're building a people-powered movement, unlike anything Georgia has ever seen to accomplish, and what no state has ever done. And that candidate, some of their door hangers that canvassers have been using also says a Georgia where everyone can thrive. So again, us modeling for candidates out there who we may not be working directly with, of course we're not working directly with, but we're modeling how do we talk about the role of government in the economy and what things you can put in place that actually can create an economy where everybody can thrive. Next slide. So our partners in Washington have actively been out in communities around the state with their All In for Washington campaign. I really love how they stay really grounded in their vision. What I love about their vision is that it does talk a lot about the economy, but it gives the economy a purpose, right? Which is fundamentally about quality of life in all communities. And I love how they talk a lot about foundations, right? The things that government pays for and good policies, those are foundations for good economy. And we know that talking about government and good policy as foundations to thriving communities and to a stronger economy, it's really great messaging. So they have a really also a cool affirmative campaign that's all about seizing the economic narrative. Next slide. This is just a screen grab of one of their Twitter posts where they were asking people to, through their website, you can actually go and play a little bit of a game where you manipulate the tax code. And it's actually a way of engaging people directly in what solutions look like. I mean, we know from our work with the Opportunity Agenda and the research they've done how important it is to mention solutions early and often. If you're talking about your solutions, you can be pretty sure that you're not giving any space or any airtime to the opponents. And this is a cool example of that, where people can actually go and make choices themselves. And what's great about it is tax and budget games in the past might have been like, go here to see how much you would have to cut, right, in order to meet this person's target for their tax cut. So see how much you'd have to cut from government. And instead, this is very affirmative, right? It's actually go in here yourself and manipulate solutions. See what we could buy if we closed a corporate tax loophole. It's just a great example of going on the offense. So next up, the next slide is a roadmap to a stronger New Mexico. What I really love about this campaign is, we know from various progressive narrative research efforts how important the story of place can be. So they've really grounded themselves in a story of place and about people's pride and how much they value what's unique to New Mexico. They've also done a great job of always having take action everywhere, which we know isn't just about plugging people in and having their voices be heard. It's actually a messaging technique too. When you're talking about take action, you're actually engaging people, reminding people that these things are actually solvable if we come together. And lastly, I'll just say that one way in which they're really going on the offense, if they're always using terms like roadmap, blueprint, roads, so things about choices. So they're constantly, even without using the term solutions, really pointing to the fact that, hey, we're the group, we're a coalition, we are the people who have a plan for how to make New Mexico stronger. So really grounded in a cool narrative about place, but also really sticking to a solutions-oriented story about New Mexico. It's really exciting. So next slide. This is just another quick screen grab from their campaign. And I really like, again, they lead with sort of make New Mexico's children and families the highest priority. And they really do a good job of staying away from jargon, good paying jobs, government that works for everyone. Really excited about where they're headed in this campaign in New Mexico. And I love that it says our people, right? So next slide. And so lastly, I'll mention this campaign, the We the People campaign in Pennsylvania. Unlike some of the other campaigns I've already mentioned, it's a little bit more of a resistance, so to speak, message. So our plan to get Pennsylvania back on track. So that kind of implies that some group out there has sort of taken it off the rails or take Pennsylvania in a wrong direction. And that, this is very deliberate on our part, having gone around the state talking to partners and communities about how should they talk about things. But what I like about it is it doesn't dwell on that. It's still fundamentally about what's our plan. So they jump right to their things about fair wages, secure democracy, healthcare, right? Getting people the things they need to thrive. And of course, again, the language about we. I also think if we're going to stay away from myth busting and really be affirmative and really be using our airtime to tell our story about how the economy, if you're using phrases like we, us, our, together, we, if you're using phrases like that, you can be pretty sure that you're not giving any of your, precious airtime with your audiences to the other side's narratives and stories about the economy. So I think this is a really cool example. Again, it kind of hints at we're trying to take in a new direction as if it's been taken the wrong way, but without dwelling on that or getting into the details about why, which of course, as we just heard from Julie, would be from a messaging standpoint, not helpful at all. So next and last slide. This is just a quick another screen grab from their campaign. I love that it leads again with our path forward. Again, kind of like New Mexico, you've got path. So words like path, roadmap, blueprint, all pointing towards solutions, and that sort of we're the ones who knows what works, knows how we can have economic policies that help everybody to thrive. So I'm just really excited about these campaigns. We have a lot of other examples of our state partners who are doing this amazing work, and we've been supportive and working with them on their messaging and around creating cool, great content and thinking about their direct engagement strategies. But it's exciting. And it really came out of our network and leaders in our network coming together and having that kind of conversation that the opportunity to this walking us through today and calling on all of us to have, which is how can we just go on the affirmative, go on the offense, and use our communications and our work out there to really consistently tell a more proactive story about the economy and not use our precious airtime with our audiences, right? To be repeating any of the myths that we just know. Every time we repeat them, they'll just harden in our audience's minds. So I just feel like this is a good example of these campaigns of us trying to do the things that Julie was just talking to us about. So I'm excited about it, and I'm happy to engage in any conversation or answer questions. And again, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Elaine. That was really great. I was curious, looking at the examples you provided, do you know if any obstacles or hurdles that groups like the ones you mentioned have had in telling proactive stories?
Well, yeah, there's lots. One is around just the basic question of resources. When you're in an environment, like particularly working at the state level has been for at least since 2010, where you feel like at every turn, you could spend 150% of your time doing defense and you still wouldn't cover all the ground really necessary to beat those things back. And this is a fundamentally a different way of really approaching our work. So it's just really creating the time and space in organizations to come together around a shared commitment to doing this. And then the harder part is then really deciding, okay, we're going to dedicate this much more resources, or if we're fundraising for new resources, we're going to build in a proactive strategy for that rather around defense. Just kind of giving yourself time to have that conversation to get on the same page, and then really taking those next hard steps and dedicating the resources, the time, and reorienting at least a decent share of the work in your organization towards towards going on the offense. I mean, that's the most obvious one. And like I said, and as Julie mentioned, it really is a challenge when you're looking at the typical coverage or how popular culture, or particularly in election season, you're just constantly seeing, really pervasive, harmful, ugly myths being told about people, about poverty. It's really hard not to refute those, but we just know in the end, and thank goodness for the opportunity and others, research just consistently shows the best way to refute those and to make those things die, right, is to tell a different story about why economic outcomes are what they are and what policies would make a difference.
That's great. And so what would it look like for an organization to make space for crafting proactive messages? Like internally, how does an organization go about doing that? Instead of doing this sort of knee-jerk reactions to the other side that we're always having to respond,
Well, so one thing that clearly has been a part of this work is in the past, a lot of our state partners had active work to advance specific policies. So perhaps there was a campaign around raising a particular tax on corporations or the wealthy to invest, or maybe a paid sick leave campaign, or a minimum wage campaign, or an earned income tax credit campaign. But those weren't often put together under one umbrella. So if you were to take a set of policies and say, what if instead of talking only about how this particular policy would help this particular group, what would we say about how all of these policies together really would lay a much stronger foundation for economic opportunity for all in the state? So thinking about what would be if we were to pull all these policies together and tie them together with a narrative that you could weave throughout, what would that narrative be? So that seems to be an important part of this, because when you do that, when you lump them together and think, what's the bigger story that connects these, you end up pushing yourself to think about a broader narrative that can actually carry all of these. And you end up with some different things, kind of like New Mexico really telling a story about place. It can kind of push you in that direction when you think about, instead of them being sort of siloed as particular issue areas, particular policies, what kind of narrative could weave a thread throughout all of them is at least one thing that comes to mind. And it's always a question of resources. We have been in a position to also help with some resources, particularly around getting these communications out in the world. So, clearly there's always a resource question, but it starts with pulling these things together, thinking about what's the overarching narrative that could really, take off in our state.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be taking questions from y'all that are listening in. So, be sure to use the question box on the GoToWebinar panel to ask some questions of our guest speakers. In the meantime, I had another question for Julie. I think it's really interesting how you were talking about the story but not the myth. And I was just thinking about other examples, particularly around the economy, like sort of this discussion around the tax cuts, how there were these two, as some people call them, tax scams that happened recently. Could you maybe give us another example, like how you would talk about the story about that, but not address the myths associated with it?
Sure. Yes, I mean, I think, as Elaine was saying, backing up and thinking, what is the narrative that you want to put forward? What is the story that you would like to see out there around taxes and what they do for our country and what they do for our economy and what they actually mean to people, because they're so vilified, as we know. How to talk about, really lay that out for people. What would that story look like, and how are all of the messages that you're putting out there either contributing to that story or feeding the story that vilifies taxes? So, just really backing up and thinking that through, I think can lead to a lot of answers about how to, when you do have to be reactive, how to react to things, while also hopefully at the same time having that consistent drumbeat of the positive story that you want out there about what taxes really mean.
That's great.
Hey,
Elaine,
Will,
do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just have a couple little practical tips that seem to help me a lot to stay in an affirmative ground. One is I like to scan communications for the words but and the words don't, right? So government doesn't hurt the economy. More regulation won't kill jobs, right? So search for don't but, just literally search for them on your website and documents. And when you find them, those often can be places where you've gone astray a little bit and you're telling the other side story. The second one is there's been some research, and I'm sure Julie's probably more familiar with than I am, that oftentimes what gets 2 or 3 days after you deliver a message to somebody, the thing that they're left with are the big words and they forget the little words. So let's say, for example, you were out there and you had the phrase, immigrants pay taxes. Well, we know what people are hearing 95 times out of 100 is something about immigrants, right, don't pay taxes or they're a drain on their system. But let's say your message is immigrants pay taxes. Well, 2 or 3 days from now, imagine that the only words that were still staying in someone's mind were the big words, and they had dropped the little words like the word pay or the word do or the word don't. And if you take the little words out, what words are folks left with? So shifting, for example, in that space to telling something like immigrants contribute to our communities, and then having talking then as a follow-up about taxes being one example. So think about, drop the little words and look at what words are left, and also scan and search your own documents for the words don't, but, won't. That can also be a place to really quickly find places where we're, inadvertently giving some airtime to our opponent's narratives.
That's really great. We have a question further from what you're talking about is what should you do when you see partners of yours myth-busting? Couldn't it make it look like that you're not responding appropriately if you're not doing like they're doing? Do either of y'all have any thoughts on that?
I can start out. I think one thing is to make clear what your strategy is. If you can have internal conversations, this is what we've decided how we're going to tell our story, and give reasons why, if you can have those kind of, offside conversations. But, I think just the power of hopefully telling these very affirmative stories, these powerful long-term narratives, hopefully, other people will see that and be drawn over. But, it's a struggle because it is an instinct to want to refute false information, to want to be on the defense. Sometimes it's all we feel we have time for. So, it is an ongoing struggle. And I would say the best thing is to be just affirmative ourselves. But Elaine might have some more kind of tactical ideas because, we see it all the time for sure. And we're just, trying to get the positive story out there ourselves.
Yeah, 2 quick observations. One is, rather than telling folks, partners, we shouldn't be refuting or we shouldn't be telling myths. It's a simple restatement of saying we best refute the myths by telling truth. I know that sounds simple, but just reminding people that we best refute when we tell truth. Another example is to just take, and I've done this in some trainings and workshops I do, when someone's out there restating myths, we'll do that work together to restate them as truth. And when I've done this with partners in rooms, it can really transform a room. When people look up and see their list of truths, like say up on a big screen, it's much more empowering to feel like you're on that affirmative ground. So I remember seeing a fact sheet that was, I think it was about SNAP, and it was sort of trying to refute all the myths about SNAP or food assistance, right? And it was all these myths like, SNAP. A myth might have been SNAP is a waste of taxpayer dollars. And it was a whole list of myths like that. Instead, we just took them and rewrote them. So on SNAP is a waste of taxpayer dollars, that shifted to SNAP does a great job of getting resources where they need to be, in the hands of the struggling families that need help, right? So something like that. So just take them and rewrite them. Do that little bit of work in your coalition meetings to just literally rewrite them. And when people who have been holding on to the need to restate them as see their things up there as truths, for most people, I think that's very transforming and empowering, and I think can go a long way towards what you just raised, Will.
That's very good. Yeah, those are very good points. I'm also thinking about things like also issues that have come up in recent weeks or months about, SNAP or about work requirements. And I think it's so difficult to talk about that because even by using that frame, the jargon of work requirements, that you're already thinking about it in the other side's terms, like require the idea that people who are receiving support through food stamps and other things are not working. So do you have any really specific examples to talk about that too, about how to deal with that issue, or how some of your partners are addressing it?
Yes, work requirements has been an extremely difficult place for messaging, and we have built up some messaging guidance, and it's specifically on that, and we've actually commissioned some message testing research too, and if folks want to reach out to me one-on-one, I can share that with them. It's been pretty clear to us that rather than spending any time explaining to people what this is, we need to get right to the heart of what it is in the broader sense. So in the way that fits best with what we're talking about today, pivoting right to this actually creates barriers to work, right? Or this actually makes it harder for struggling families to just get the basic help they need. And just calling these things, pivoting immediately, just call these things cuts. That's what these things are. These aren't like reforms that might harm some certain group of people. These are just outright cuts. I think we often forget that when people in pollsters and message testing firms look at these things, they usually come back to us and say, hey, Medicaid, SNAP, all of these things, they're actually really popular with people. We forget that, and we can build off of that. And people don't want to see these programs cut. So non-jargon language about what the program is and what it does, and then instead of calling their plan a reform or a proposal, just jump right to calling it just a cut that will be actually a barrier to work or holding families back, struggling families from just getting the help that they need. Some other groups that we work with have been trying some more creative language. I know was with a partner in Alabama who's been talking about the work penalty, right? So actually, we also sometimes should take a step back and ask ourselves, do we have to call their proposal what they are calling their proposal? Or is there space to reframe it right from the outset? So, those are a few thoughts off the top of my head.
Yeah, somebody just commented from our listeners saying that here in Minnesota, we've been stating it as reporting requirements. So they don't even say work requirements.
Yep, that's a great example.
Yeah. So there's another question from a participant about the issue about visuals and visual myth-busting. For example, the image of the woman that was in Julie's presentation of the large soda is a form of or underline a harmful myth or stereotype. So I guess the question is, do we need how should we pay attention to visuals that also contribute to myth busting?
Yeah, that's an important question. Thank you. I think it's worth, as Elaine was talking about, going through and examining all the words we're using. It's worth going through and examining all the visuals. Is this visual contributing to that larger story, or is it reinforcing something that we don't want to have out there?
Yeah.
The only thing I'll add to that is I think thinking about the balance between the stories that tell a deficit-based picture of what we're working on. So we do need those, right? We do need to tell the raw story about how families are struggling, but we often leave out visuals that are actually about our vision, or the visuals that are about here's what we're actually trying to create. So I think rethinking our balance a little bit between sort of that deficit, here's the harsh reality, and the visuals that pair up with our vision or what we're trying to accomplish. Shifting that balance a little bit towards the vision and what we're going for, I think could be helpful.
Yeah, I just saw this video that the ACLU did about connecting the issue about family separation at the border with the midterms. And the entire video was all happy families, saying, singing "You Are My Sunshine." It sounds kind of schmaltzy, but it's actually pretty good. But it's all about the values that we have as like family togetherness and stuff. And I thought it was really powerful, because you're right. It's showing visuals of what we envision, what we see, what we want everybody to have, and these families are not getting as a result of government policy. So,
sometimes I think the harsh moments that grab our attention and can get everyone's attention right away, like the audios of children crying, break open a public moment in a way, and then it's the question of what will we do with that public moment. I think often our role in that public moment is to then say there's a better way forward, and our visuals can match up with that. I heard a speech by Reverend Barber, from the Poor People's Campaign last week, who was saying he and some other pastors are going to start when someone dies as a direct result of not having health insurance, he's going to start having open casket funerals, and instead of eulogies that basically say this person was sort of called up by God, he's going to say, no, this person just died as a result of government policy violence. And of course, that's a beautiful thing. That's a prophetic thing. And that's like a version of the kids crying. So if Reverend Barber and some pastors manage to get public attention, media attention, lawmaker attention with something that really jolts us, right, and wakes us up, then I think as kind of policy advocates and activists, our role is then to step in when they break that open a little bit and get some attention with something that's more about, here are solutions, right? Here are things that, here's how government could do that would create a better vision, right, where we wouldn't see that anymore. And so I think it sometimes can be the role of some people to break open that conversation in this way. But then our role needs to be to come in and help people see that, you know, solutions can happen and what those would look like.
That's great. That's great. So we have time for another question if folks want to type that into the question control panel. Julie, do you have other examples that you would like to share about? I'm just trying to think like how we could do. I was also thinking about, you know, the migrant caravan too, like how that's such in the news right now. I mean, I know it's not economic, but it just seems to be in the headlines so much now. Would you have some suggestions about how we could talk about that as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, you know, Elaine's point about when something is broken open like this, and it's really an opportunity for us to think about how we're contributing to the larger story. You know, obviously there's all sorts of lies going on. The administration had to admit one of them about whether or not there had been, you know, certain kinds of people in this caravan. That's already all over the headlines. What's our role in this? Do we need to contribute by putting out another myth fact sheet, or should we be telling what our story is, what the real solutions are, why we know folks are coming and what they're coming toward, and what we need to be doing as a country to uphold our values?
That's great. So we have a final question, which is, or wanted your feedback on, is that lies work well and last long because they often feed our implicit biases and are repeated a lot. So my question is, how can positive, truthful messaging have stronger bite or impact?
Well, I really liked what Elaine was saying about thinking about the big words that you leave people with, and a lot of times those are the more emotional words. They're the ones that make us think about what our values are, what kind of country we want to be, what our identity are. These are all things that hit more than facts and figures are going to, and they're going to stay with people longer. So we can have that long-term vision that is appealing to people and really makes them think about, you know, our goals, then that can stay longer. It's also true that, you know, there is some negative stuff that is just going to hit harder and stay longer. But again, we have to ask ourselves, what are we really contributing to over the long term?
It's true.
There's lots of evidence that shows people need to hear something several times for it to sort of feel like a truth or feel like the common, you know, conventional wisdom to them. Something like 7 times. So I also don't think we can understate that. Even though sometimes to us it feels like, oh, I need a fresh new way to say this every day. Well, not necessarily. We just haven't, that person hasn't heard from us just enough times. And continuing to push ourselves to take jargon out of our language. I saw there was a fascinating article in the Atlantic magazine the other day looking at basically only 3% of Americans, and they're really white with lots of college degrees and earn over $100,000 a year, actually like the idea of having politically correct language. So just continuing to push ourselves to think, am I using jargon? Am I using words that get in the way, or am I using words that actually relate to the everyday experience that people are having? And it is a challenge for us, particularly when we feel like we have expertise or when we feel like issues are complicated. But we can do it. There's so many examples now of even the people, even the groups who are with us today, really pushing ourselves to get away from the jargon and use that simple everyday language of telling our truth.
Right, that's very true. And sometimes I think it's something that we have to practice internally within our organizations with each other, because sometimes we use language or jargon because we understand it internally, but then it's hard to make that switch where we talk externally, you know?
Absolutely.
So that's something I'll have to think about. Well, thanks so much again, Julie and Elaine, for sharing your expertise with us today. I think this was really great. And to folks that are on the webinar who have called in or are watching online, if you have questions about today's materials, feel free to reach out to me by email or Twitter. And we'll also send you a link with this recording and the PowerPoint as a follow-up, so you can share with your colleagues who couldn't join us. But as you close out a GoToWebinar, there's going to be a short evaluation that's going to pop up. If you could fill that out, that'd be really great, because it would make sure that we offer the best possible content to our partners like you in the future. So thanks again, Elaine and Julie, and thanks to all y'all that participated today, and have a great day.